In the quiet village of Masarhi, India, life was simple. Families lived close together, and everyone supported one another. But this peaceful life changed when children started to disappear. At first, no one asked questions, maybe because of sadness, maybe because of fear. But everything took a shocking turn when an 8-year-old boy calmly admitted to the killings. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just smiled. His name was Amarjeet Sada, the world's youngest serial killer. In 2006, in the small village of Masarhi, Bihar, India, life was tough. Most people worked long hours, doing hard labor just to earn enough to eat. Despite the poverty, the village had a strong sense of community. Families were close, and neighbors looked out for each other. The children played a huge role in keeping that sense of togetherness alive. There were kids everywhere, running through the streets, laughing and playing together every day. Most of them were related because a big family, the Sada family, lived in the village. Everyone knew each other, and there was a lot of love and warmth despite the struggles. But then, one day, everything changed. A 6-year-old girl, a member of the Sada family, suddenly stopped showing up to play. At first, people outside the family just noticed she was missing, but they didn't ask questions. That's just how things were in this village. People didn't like to interfere in each other's matters, especially when it came to something tragic. They assumed the family was dealing with something difficult and kept their distance out of respect. A couple of months later, another child went missing. This time, it was a newborn baby, a little girl who meant the world to her mother. Her mother worked from home so she could take care of her, but suddenly, the baby was gone. There was no explanation. Her family didn't say a word, and they never mentioned her again. There was no crying, no mourning. It was as if she had never existed. This left the townspeople confused and concerned. 2 young girls had disappeared within months of each other, but still, no one dared to ask questions. Then, in 2007, another little girl went missing. This time, she wasn't from the Sada family. Her name was Khushbu, and she was only 6 months old. One day, Khushbu's mother needed to get some things done around the house. She had many tasks to do, but since she couldn't do them while caring for her baby, she dropped Khushbu off at the local primary school. The school had a daycare or safe place where children could be watched over, so it seemed like a good option for her baby. It's not clear if Khushbu's mother was a single parent or if her husband was at work, but either way, she had to handle the responsibilities of the house on her own that day. She didn't have anyone else to help her, so leaving her baby at the school seemed like the best solution. She thought that the staff would keep an eye on Khushbu while she focused on her tasks. However, when she returned to pick her up, Khushbu was nowhere to be found. Her mother panicked. She ran around the village, asking everyone if they had seen her daughter. None of the school staff had noticed anything unusual, and Khushbu obviously couldn't have left on her own. But, even more confusing, no one saw anyone take her either. The whole situation was unsettling. In her desperate search, Khushbu's mother ran into a member of the Sada family. She explained what had happened, how her baby had disappeared, and how she couldn't find her anywhere. That's when the family member had a terrible feeling that something was seriously wrong. Without wasting any time, they called the police. When the police arrived, the family member led them to a group of kids playing outside. They called over a little 8-year-old boy who came running toward them. The police asked him if he knew anything about Khushbu's disappearance. To their shock, he calmly told them that Khushbu was dead, and he knew this because he had killed her. At first, the officers didn't believe him. After all, he was just a child, and children often make up stories. But then, the boy led them to a shallow grave at the edge of the village. There, they found Khushbu's body. The boy explained how he had taken Khushbu from the school when no one was looking. He took her to an open field and harmed her, but that wasn't enough for him. Since she was just a baby, she couldn't speak, only cry. That didn't satisfy him. Wanting more control and fear, he picked up a rock and struck her repeatedly. The authorities were shocked, not just by the tragic fate of an innocent baby, but by the fact that the one responsible was only an 8-year-old child. They immediately took him into custody. As he sat there, waiting for further questioning, The officers noticed something unsettling. The boy didn't seem afraid or remorseful. He wasn't crying or showing any regret. Instead, he was smiling. Every time he looked at one of the officers, he grinned. It was as if he didn't fully understand the gravity of what had happened. He simply asked for biscuits and sat there, swinging his legs, eating them as if it were just another day. When the police asked why he had done it, he didn't answer. He only smiled, showing no emotion. His name was Amarjeet Sada. He was born in 1998 in the Begusarai district of Bihar, India. Some sources refer to him as Amarjeet Sada, but most people call him Amarjeet. Amarjeet came from a very poor family. His father was the only one who worked, doing a low-paying manual labor job. With so many to feed, his father's income was hardly enough for the family. His mother, despite the struggles, was planning to have more children, which would only make their situation harder. When Amarjeet was 6 years old, his family decided to move to a new village, hoping his father could find a better-paying job. They settled in Masarhi, the village where this tragic case would later unfold. His father found work as a farm laborer, but even though it paid slightly better, they were still struggling to make ends meet. However, in a way, Amarjeet and his siblings didn't feel too different from other kids because the entire village was very poor. Almost everyone earned the same low wages, and there were very few middle-class or wealthy families. His mother stayed home, taking care of their many children. In fact, at the time of this case, she had just given birth to another baby. She was constantly busy, running around trying to care for all of them. Meanwhile, the older kids spent most of their days outside, playing in the streets with their friends, cousins, and siblings. It was a big group of children, all running around together. If you remember, he was caught because of a member of his own family. Someone from the Sada family had a feeling they knew who was responsible. When Khushbu's mother was desperately searching for her baby, this family member stepped forward and told her their suspicion. They were the ones who called the police and led them straight to Amarjeet. But how did a family member suspect him so quickly? Amarjeet already had a reputation in the village. He was known as a troublemaker. Other kids feared him because he was mean. He would hit, kick, steal, and just overall act aggressively. It wasn't just harmless mischief. There was something much darker in the way he acted. The villagers knew he had a violent side, but his own family knew there was something even worse about him. Remember the 2 little girls who went missing before Khushbu? The ones who seemed to vanish without a trace? The truth was, they didn't just disappear. Amarjeet had something to do with it. The first girl who went missing was his cousin. She was 6 years old, and this happened in 2006. Amarjeet was only 7 at the time. It turned out that he had killed her in almost the same way he later killed Khushbu. He took his cousin to a quiet, isolated place, far from the village where no one could see them. Then, he started strangling her. He watched closely as fear took over her face, as she struggled to breathe. But right before she could die, he suddenly let go. He stood there, watching as she gasped for air, trying to recover, but he wasn't done. A moment later, he picked up a rock and began smashing it against her head repeatedly until she was dead. Amarjeet's actions showed something truly disturbing. He didn't just kill his cousin, he made it slow and painful, wanting her to feel fear and suffering. With Khushbu, he didn't get the same reaction because she was a baby. But with his cousin, he got exactly what he wanted. After the murder, Amarjeet didn't hide what he had done. He confessed to his family right away. But instead of reporting it, they made a shocking decision to keep quiet. They buried the truth. They didn't want the village to know what their child had done, fearing it would bring shame to the family. They chose to protect Amarjeet, who was only 7, believing that if this came out, it would ruin his life. Amarjeet's parents punished him, but didn't fully explain the severity of his actions. He claimed he didn't understand that hitting his cousin with a rock would kill her. It seemed he didn't grasp what death truly meant. They believed that after talking to him, Amarjeet understood the consequences and would move on. But a few months later, he proved them wrong when he killed again. This time, his victim was his baby sister. As I mentioned earlier, Amarjeet's mother had a baby shortly after moving to Masarhi village. By then, the little girl was about 8 months old. One day, while she was napping, Amarjeet quietly picked her up and took her to a secluded spot. There, He did the unthinkable. He murdered her, just like he had done before. He strangled her for a while before finally hitting her until she died. This was his second murder in just 6 months. When his family noticed the baby was missing, they immediately confronted Amarjeet. He didn't try to lie. He admitted right away that he had killed her. But shockingly, his family still didn't report it. Once again, they kept it a secret, brushing it off as a family matter and never telling anyone. In 2008, Amarjeet killed again. This time, it was Khushbu. But this murder couldn't be hidden. Khushbu wasn't part of the family, and her mother wasn't going to cover it up. She wanted answers and justice. As soon as Khushbu went missing, a member of the Sada family immediately suspected Amarjeet. They had always known what he was capable of. His family had lived with the truth, that he was a child killer, not once, but twice, and they had done nothing to stop him. Despite their efforts to punish him and teach him right from wrong, nothing worked. Amarjeet didn't think what he was doing was wrong. By the time he was just 8 years old, he had taken 3 lives. At this point, Amarjeet Sada was officially a serial killer. As soon as he was caught, psychologists and psychiatrists were eager to study him, trying to understand what was going on in the mind of such a young boy. How does an 8-year-old become a serial killer? That was the question everyone wanted to answer. What made this even more disturbing was that Amarjeet wasn't influenced by anything. He didn't have access to TV, books, or stories about murderers. He had never heard of serial killers or anything like that. He wasn't exposed to any media that could have planted the idea in his head. And yet, at just 7 years old, he committed his first murder. There was no clear reason or motive. He killed simply because he wanted to. One psychologist who assessed him later testified in court. They called him a sadist, someone who gets pleasure from causing pain. And they were talking about an 8-year-old, which is very rare. Experts agreed that his actions were due to psychological issues. He was diagnosed with several conditions, but all pointed to one thing: a mental disorder, not something he learned from the outside world. His brain was just made this way. One of the main diagnoses was conduct disorder, which is given to kids or teens who hurt others or break rules. In mild cases, this might include things like breaking stuff or stealing. Most kids with conduct disorder commit crimes like theft or vandalism, but Amarjeet went straight to murder. And he did it more than once. Because of his age, Amarjeet couldn't be sent to prison. In India, the law doesn't allow anyone under 18 to be imprisoned. So instead, he was sent to a juvenile facility where he would stay until he turned 18. He couldn't stay in a juvenile facility forever, and eventually, he was released. Given that Amarjeet was born in 1998, he would be around 27 years old now. That means he may be out there somewhere. It's believed that he might have changed his name to Somkid and is now living a new life under this new identity. It's unsettling to think that the youngest serial killer in history, someone who showed no remorse and didn't truly understand his actions, could just be living his life. If you passed him on the street, you might not even recognize him. Now, there's a conspiracy theory that often comes up when discussing this case. Some people believe Amarjeet never actually killed anyone and was framed or used as a scapegoat. They think he wasn't responsible for the first 2 murders. While it's unclear what this theory says about the third victim, Khushbu, since Amarjeet confessed to killing her, the theory suggests that perhaps an older family member committed the first 2 murders and then blamed Amarjeet. Being only 7 years old, it would have been easy to manipulate him into confessing, and his parents might have convinced him he was the one who did it. At that age, he might have just believed them. Before continuing, it's important to clarify that this is just a theory. According to the law, Amarjeet Sada is a serial killer. This is not meant to excuse or justify anything, but rather to present an alternative perspective that some people have considered. One reason people believe this theory is that the bodies were hidden. A child who doesn't understand the consequences of murder might not think to hide the bodies. If Amarjeet truly didn't think he did anything wrong, why would he go through the effort of hiding them? And if he was willing to confess to his parents, his uncle, and the police, wouldn't he have just left the bodies where they were? There's also another theory that he wasn't the killer, but rather an accomplice. This would explain why he knew the details of the murders. Maybe an older family member committed the crimes and told Amarjeet to confess. But again, these are just theories. What remains true is that, in the eyes of the law, Amarjeet Sada is a serial killer. He murdered 3 children. These theories likely exist because it's hard to accept that an 8-year-old could commit such horrific acts, especially against other children. The idea of children killing children is difficult to understand. Children are supposed to be innocent, loving, and pure, so the idea that a child could commit extreme violence is deeply unsettling. However, in rare cases like this one, it does happen. The most frightening part of this case is that even children, who we believe to be innocent, can be capable of such darkness. That's all for today's case. It's a chilling story, and I'm curious to know what you all think. Do you believe the official story, or do you think there's more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love reading your comments. If you found this case interesting, be sure to hit that like button, share it with others, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. In 2019, a man walked out of a Thai prison, finally free after serving time for murder. But just 7 months later, he was accused of killing again. This is the shocking story of Somkid Pumpuang, known as Thailand's Jack the Ripper. How did a convicted killer escape justice and take another life? Today, we're looking into the dark past of a man who spread fear across Thailand and the system that failed to stop him. On January 30th, 2005, Thailand faced a shocking tragedy no one expected. Around 9 a.m., hotel staff in Mukdahan subdistrict made a discovery they would never forget. While cleaning one of the rooms, they found the lifeless body of a young woman. Fear and panic took over as they realized what had happened, and they quickly called the police. When officers arrived, they were met with a disturbing sight. The room was a mess, with clear signs of a violent struggle. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings were scattered across the floor, and broken glass was everywhere. It was evident that the victim had fought for her life. As the police searched further, they made a gruesome find. In the bathroom, the woman's body was face down in the bathtub. Upon turning her over, the investigators saw bruises and marks around her neck. She had been strangled. The victim was soon identified as 25-year-old Waruni Phimphobooter, a cafe singer who worked hard to support her parents and 5 younger siblings. Known for her kindness, her bright smile, and her dedication to her family, Waruni was well liked by everyone who knew her. Though she didn't make much money, she had always tried her best to take care of her loved ones. So, when a man who claimed to be a talent scout approached her with an offer of a better job, she saw it as a chance to improve her life and provide more for her family. She agreed to meet him, hoping that this opportunity would lead to something better. Waruni checked into the hotel with this man, but there was something strange about the situation. Witnesses, including her friends and the hotel staff, all confirmed that she had arrived with him. However, the man had not provided any form of identification, which was highly unusual for a hotel guest. This raised a lot of red flags for the police. To make matters even worse, the investigators found no leads to follow. They collected DNA evidence and fingerprints from the scene, hoping to find something that would point them toward the killer. However, when they ran the data through their database, there were no matches. The case grew even more complicated when they learned the hotel had no CCTV cameras, leaving them with almost no way to track the man's movements or identify him. Back in 2005, surveillance technology wasn't as widespread as it is today, making criminal investigations much more challenging. Unlike today's world, where security cameras are placed on almost every street corner and digital footprints can be traced easily. Back then, police had to rely heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and manual detective work. In this particular case, the only real clue authorities had was the name the suspect used to check in, Somkid. But this created a big problem. The name Somkid was very common in Thailand, making it hard to identify a single suspect. Without any other clear leads, the case quickly lost momentum. As days turned into weeks, it seemed like the case would remain unsolved. However, the calm didn't last long. On June 4, 2005, nearly 700 kilometers away in Muang Lampang district, another shocking discovery was made. The body of 34-year-old Phongphan Sapchai was found in a hotel room, and it was strikingly similar to the previous case. Just like Waruni, the first known victim, Phongphan had been strangled. Her personal items, including her cell phone and a valuable gold ring, were missing, suggesting that the killer had taken them, possibly as trophies or to destroy any evidence. The brutality of the crime pointed to a methodical and planned attack. To make matters worse, the autopsy report revealed that Phongphan had been pregnant at the time of her death, making the crime even more heartbreaking. Not only was she killed, but so was her unborn child. Despite these similarities, investigators were still struggling to connect the cases. Before law enforcement could make any significant progress, the killer struck again. This time the crime took place in Muang Udon Thani district, about 400 kilometers away from the previous murder scene. On June 19, 2005, just 2 weeks after Phongphan's murder, another woman was found dead in a hotel room. The victim was identified as 37-year-old Porntawan Pangkabuder, a masseuse. Once again, the cause of death was strangulation, and disturbingly, the body was placed inside a bathtub filled with water. This was not a hasty crime, it was planned. The way the body was positioned suggested the killer had a ritual or was trying to confuse investigators about the exact time of death. Her belongings, like in the previous cases, were missing. However, this time there was a breakthrough. CCTV footage captured a man following Porntawan. The suspect was dressed in jeans, a white and blue t-shirt, and a light-colored jacket. Although the footage wasn't very clear, it was the first real lead the police had since the murders started. Thinking he was still escaping capture, the killer, now identified as Somkid, became even bolder. His confidence grew, and he targeted another unsuspecting victim. This time, he chose 30-year-old Somkid Pumpuang, another masseuse. Somkid used charm and deception to lure her in. He pretended to be a wealthy and successful man, offering false promises of a luxurious life. He convinced her to spend 3 days with him at a high-end hotel in Muang Buriram, making her believe she was safe. However, Somkid wasn't just a criminal. He was a master manipulator, someone who knew exactly how to gain trust before striking. His ability to deceive wasn't something he learned overnight. To understand how he became this way, we need to look back at his past. His childhood was filled with hardship, shaping him into the man he would later become. Somkid Pumpuang was born in 1964 in Nakhon Si Thammarat, Thailand, and his early life was far from easy. When he was just 8 years old, his father, a man known for his quick temper and unpredictable behavior, left the family. This was a turning point for Somkid. It wasn't just the loss of a father. He lost the stability, protection, and guidance that every child needs. With his father gone, his mother was left to struggle on her own to provide for the family. Life became much harder, and the challenges they faced shaped the rest of Somkid's life. Unable to provide for him, Somkid's mother made the difficult decision to send him to live with his uncle. However, instead of finding a caring and loving home, Somkid was placed in a household that was strict and unforgiving. The rules were rigid, discipline was harsh, and there was little to no warmth or affection. This new living situation only made things more difficult for him, and it became clear that it wasn't the supportive environment he needed. This lack of love and care set the stage for troubling behavior in Somkid. While most kids his age were out playing and making friends, he was already showing signs of deceit and manipulation. At first, Somkid started with small acts of theft, stealing sweets from market stalls and taking coins from his uncle's pockets. However, as he grew older, his behavior became more daring. He began stealing from his classmates, taking items from teachers, and even stealing from local shopkeepers. As Somkid entered his teenage years, his crimes began to escalate. He wasn't just a petty thief anymore. He had become a con artist. At school, he stole his teacher's bicycle and sold it for quick cash. When he got his first job, Instead of doing the work he was hired for, he embezzled money from his employer. Around this time, the people in his village started to notice. They saw him as a troublemaker, someone who had no respect for rules, morality, or authority. His uncle, desperate to control him, tried everything: scolding, punishment, even moments of kindness, but nothing worked. Somkid was beyond help. Eventually, the villagers had enough. One day, a group of teenagers, fed up with his constant lies and theft, decided to take matters into their own hands. They chased him down and beat him badly. It was a humiliating moment for Somkid and a turning point in his life. However, instead of seeing it as a chance to change, he took it as a sign that it was time to leave. He ran away from home, leaving his past and everything behind. From that point on, his life began to spiral completely out of control. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Somkid turned to even more serious crimes to survive. He learned how to deceive people, manipulate situations, and most frighteningly, how to hurt others. Without a home, family, or any rules to follow, he saw the world as his playground, and the people in it as opportunities to exploit. He understood human weakness and used it to his advantage. When needed, he could be charming, and when it suited him, he was ruthless. Experts believe that Somkid's troubled childhood played a significant role in shaping the person he became. The abandonment by his father left him with deep feelings of rejection and anger. Growing up without a stable home or proper guidance, he never learned the importance of empathy or the difference between right and wrong. Instead, he learned to survive by lying, manipulating, and committing crimes. Somkid never formed real connections with people because he never saw them as equals, only as tools to help him get what he wanted. Somkid's troubled past had shaped him into a cold and calculating predator. He had spent years perfecting the art of deception, and now his darkest instincts had taken over. By now, the police were certain they were dealing with a serial killer. However, Somkid wasn't just any murderer. He was a skilled manipulator who knew exactly how to earn trust before betraying it in the worst way possible. He preyed on vulnerable women, often those working as masseuses or cafe servers, struggling to make ends meet. These women, hoping for a better future, fell for his lies, never realizing they were walking into a deadly trap. As the number of victims grew to 5 across 4 different provinces, the urgency to catch him escalated. Law enforcement agencies across multiple regions joined forces, determined to stop him before he could strike again. However, the investigation wasn't easy. Detectives faced countless challenges that slowed them down. Many of the crime scenes had no CCTV cameras, making it nearly impossible to track Somkid's movements. On top of that, the lack of a centralized police database meant that different departments had trouble sharing crucial information in real time. This communication gap made the manhunt even more difficult. Still, investigators refused to give up. They carefully examined every crime scene, searching for any clue that could lead them to the killer. They collected DNA samples, hoping to find a match, something that would finally reveal the identity of the man behind these brutal crimes. Witnesses were questioned extensively, but Somkid had a way of blending into crowds, making it incredibly difficult to gather any solid leads. Every lead seemed to go nowhere, and the investigation was at a standstill. But just when it felt like the case had hit a dead end, an unexpected breakthrough changed everything. In a surprising twist, a stolen SIM card from one of his victims was suddenly reactivated. This was the golden clue investigators had been waiting for. Acting fast, they tracked the location of the activated SIM card, and it led them straight to Somkid Pumpuang. They quickly surrounded the area and took him into custody without a struggle. At last, the reign of terror that had gripped Thailand had come to an end. During his interrogation, Somkid showed no remorse. He confessed to the brutal murders without hesitation. His motives were chilling. He killed purely for greed and the twisted sense of control he felt over his victims. To him, human lives meant nothing. They were just obstacles in his pursuit of money and control. The court wasted no time, sentencing him to multiple life terms in prison. Justice had been served, and Thailand could finally feel safe again, knowing he was behind bars. But then something completely unexpected happened. something that shocked everyone. Behind bars, Somkid started to change, or at least that's what it looked like. Over the years, he displayed good behavior, impressing prison officials with his seemingly reformed character. He obeyed the rules, joined rehabilitation programs, and behaved well in prison. His efforts didn't go unnoticed, and soon he began receiving pardons that chipped away at his life sentence, reducing his time behind bars little by little. In Thailand, the justice system prioritizes rehabilitation and second chances, believing that even the worst criminals can change. However, when it came to someone like Somkid, this leniency was heavily criticized. Many argued that certain violent criminals, especially serial killers, should never be allowed to walk free. Somkid was originally sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murders of 5 women. His crimes were not impulsive. They were carefully planned and carried out with chilling precision. Yet despite this, his sentence kept getting shorter. Thailand's justice system allowed well-behaved inmates to earn early release through royal pardons and other reductions. Experts in law and psychology warned that violent criminals like Somkid were highly likely to reoffend. Studies showed that serial offenders rarely changed, and releasing them could put more lives at risk. But even with these warnings, the system continued to work in his favor. Over time, his life sentence was reduced to just 13 years. For many, this was impossible to understand. How could a man who had taken so many lives be allowed to walk free after just over a decade? The families of his victims, law enforcement officials, and the public were outraged. Then, on May 17, 2019, something truly shocking happened. Somkid Pumpuang walked out of prison a free man. The serial killer who had once terrorized Thailand was no longer behind bars. News of his release spread like wildfire, and the public reaction was one of anger and fear. People couldn't believe that a man capable of such horrific crimes had been set free. Many people couldn't understand how a convicted serial killer had been granted early release. It felt like a complete betrayal, not just to the victims and their families, but to the entire public. How could the justice system allow someone with such a violent history to walk free? The outrage spread quickly, and soon people began demanding answers. They wanted to know what criteria had been used to assess Somkid Pumpuang's so-called rehabilitation. Did anyone truly believe he had changed? Or had the system simply taken a dangerous risk, one that would cost innocent lives? The controversy surrounding his release put immense pressure on officials. The public outcry forced the government to take a closer look at the policies that had allowed this to happen. The Director General of the Department of Corrections even admitted that the system needed urgent reform. He acknowledged that the policies allowing violent criminals like Somkid to be set free were deeply flawed. The debate over Thailand's justice system grew heated, with legal experts and concerned citizens arguing that individuals convicted of such horrific crimes should never be eligible for reduced sentences or royal pardons. Many insisted that serial killers should remain behind bars for life, without exception. But as the country focused on these debates and the failures of its justice system, something even more horrifying was about to unfold. Just 7 months after Somkid's release, on December 15, 2019, Thailand was shaken by yet another gruesome murder. The victim was Rasami Mulichan, a 51-year-old hotel maid. Her lifeless body was found wrapped tightly in a blanket, secured with layers of transparent tape. But one chilling detail stood out. Her ankle had been tied with a cell phone charger. It was a chilling and unmistakable pattern. The way she was strangled and how her body was left behind made one thing clear. This was the work of Somkid Pumpuang. An autopsy later confirmed what many had already feared. Rasami had been strangled, just like Somkid's previous victims. The reality was now undeniable. A man who had once been sentenced to life for multiple murders had been set free, and he had already killed again. The news sent shockwaves through Thailand. People were outraged. How could the justice system have made such a terrible mistake? How could a convicted serial killer be allowed back into society only to take another innocent life? The anger grew louder, with the public demanding answers. The government and law enforcement were under immense pressure, forced to face the consequences of their flawed system. As investigators dug deeper into Rasami's life, they uncovered a tragic story. Not long after his release, Pang had met Rasami through Facebook. Their online chats quickly turned into a fast-moving romance. Within days, he had moved into her home. On the outside, it seemed like a new beginning, an ex-convict trying to turn his life around with a fresh start and a new relationship. But behind closed doors, things were very different. Neighbors later revealed that the couple's relationship was anything but peaceful. Loud arguments could often be heard coming from Rasami's apartment. The fights became more frequent, and tensions escalated quickly. What started as a fast-paced romance quickly turned into something dark and toxic. On the night before Rasami was found dead, her neighbors heard yet another argument. Voices were raised, furniture was knocked over, and the sounds of a struggle echoed through the walls. But no one stepped in. To them, it was just another fight, another troubled night in a rocky relationship. The next morning, Rasami never showed up for work. Her co-workers grew worried when she didn't answer her phone. One of her neighbors noticed the silence from her apartment and decided to check on her. What they found was shocking. Her lifeless body wrapped in a blanket, held together with tape. It was as if she had been treated like an object, not a person. A nationwide manhunt was immediately launched to track down Somkid. Witnesses reported seeing him leaving Rasami's apartment around the time of the murder, and authorities knew they had to act fast. The public was terrified. He had already killed again, and if he wasn't caught soon, he could strike once more. The pressure was overwhelming, and police worked day and night to hunt him down. Just 4 days later, Somkid's short-lived freedom came to an abrupt end. He was arrested on a train after an alert passenger recognized him from the widely circulated news reports. Surprisingly, he did not resist. Maybe he knew there was no escape this time. During interrogation, Somkid confessed without hesitation. He coldly admitted that he and Rasami had argued over a motorcycle, and in a fit of rage, he had strangled her. First, he choked her until she lost consciousness. Then he kept squeezing until she was gone. His lack of remorse sent chills down the investigators' spines. In 2021, justice was finally served. Somkid was sentenced to death for his crimes. The verdict brought a sense of relief, but it could never erase the pain and fear he had caused. His case became a chilling reminder of the flaws in the justice system and the dangers of releasing violent offenders too soon. It highlighted the need for better psychological evaluations, stricter monitoring, and stronger cooperation between law enforcement agencies. For his victims, the tragedy was immeasurable. Most of them were hardworking women, simply trying to earn a living or searching for love and a better future. Instead, their lives were stolen by a ruthless predator. May these women who suffered so much find peace, and may their families, who still carry the weight of grief, one day find the closure they deserve. If this case moved you or made you think about the flaws in the justice system, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay updated on similar stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so you never miss a video. Thank you for watching.
In the late 1960s, something chilling was happening in Oregon. Young women were disappearing without a trace, leaving behind only fear and mystery. At first, detectives had no idea what happened to the missing women. However, as the investigation progressed, a suspect emerged, revealing just how twisted this killer really was. He didn't just kill for pleasure. He treated his victims like lifeless dolls. He'd dress them up, pose them for photos, and what gave him the most satisfaction? Seeing them in high heels. It was the thing that brought him the greatest pleasure. This is the case of the shoe fetish slayer. But before we begin, I must warn you, viewer discretion is advised. This case is haunting, and it will stay with you long after you hear it. Now let's get into it. Jerry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939 in Webster, South Dakota, to Henry and Eileen Brudos. He had an older brother, Larry. The family moved around often because Jerry's father had a seasonal job, so they never stayed in one place for long. Eventually, they settled in Oregon. However, Jerry's childhood was far from easy. His mother, Eileen, was very abusive. She had always wanted a daughter, and when Jerry was born, she resented him for it. Eileen showed her love and affection only to Larry, while Jerry was treated like he didn't matter. She constantly belittled him, and it had a lasting impact. One moment in Jerry's childhood stood out above all the others. When he was just 5 years old, he was walking through a junkyard and found a pair of leather high heels decorated with rhinestones. He was immediately drawn to them and decided to take them home. When Jerry Brudos got home, he eagerly put the shoes on his feet and showed them to his mother. Her reaction was one of shock. Eileen had a very conservative fashion sense and didn't approve of the shoes. She immediately ordered Jerry to take them off and throw them away. Jerry didn't want to get rid of the shoes. He was fascinated by them, so he decided to hide them from his mother. Every now and then he would secretly wear them again. But eventually his mother discovered that he had kept the shoes hidden. Furious, she made Jerry watch as she destroyed them by burning them in front of him. This moment was confusing for Jerry. He didn't understand why his mother reacted so strongly. To him, the shoes weren't something to be ashamed of, but to her, they were wrong. This moment changed Jerry. The fact that high heels were forbidden only made him want them more, sparking a growing obsession. As he got older, his fascination with women's shoes, especially high heels, became even stronger. By the time he was in his teens, he started to associate his obsession with sexual feelings. He began stealing women's underwear, often from his neighbors, and he would wear them, feeling a sense of excitement. People in the neighborhood began noticing items going missing, but at the time they didn't know it was Jerry. At 17, Jerry took things even further. He invited one of the local girls to his house, claiming he worked for the police and wanted to talk about the underwear thief. Once inside, he locked himself in another room, put on a mask, and returned with a knife. He threatened the girl and ordered her to take off her clothes. He then took photos of her while she was in a vulnerable position. Afterward, Jerry tried to convince her that the person who attacked her was a masked stranger, but she didn't believe him and quickly fled. This event seemed to give Jerry more confidence, and just months later he would attempt something even more dangerous. One day, Jerry offered to drop a girl off at her house, but instead, he drove her to a remote location and ordered her to undress for a photo. When she refused, Jerry became violent and began to attack her. Luckily, a passing couple saw what was happening and stopped to help. They called the police and Jerry was arrested. Despite his violent actions, Jerry wasn't sent to prison. Instead, it was decided that he would be sent to the Oregon State Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. While he was there, the police searched his home and found Polaroid photos he had taken of the girl he attacked, wearing a mask. It was clear to the police that Jerry was a very disturbed young man. However, the doctors at the hospital concluded that this was just a phase Jerry was going through. They dismissed his violent behavior as part of puberty and thought it would eventually pass. This was despite Jerry openly admitting to his doctors that he fantasized about creating an underground prison to keep young girls and women and hurt them whenever he wanted. They even thought Jerry might have been suffering from schizophrenia, but still didn't believe he was mentally ill enough to keep him locked up. It's hard to understand how they came to that conclusion. He was admitted to the hospital for about 9 months. During that time, he could go to school during the day and return to the hospital at night. By early 1957, Jerry was discharged and sent back home to live with his family. Later that year, he graduated from high school. After graduating, Jerry joined the Army and was stationed in California. However, even while serving, he continued to have violent fantasies about controlling women. He also began having disturbing dreams about a Korean girl sneaking into his bed and trying to seduce him. He spoke to an Army psychiatrist about these fantasies, and as a result, they decided to discharge him because they felt he was mentally unfit for the military. Once again, Jerry went back to live with his family in Corvallis, Oregon. After he was discharged from the Army, his mother refused to let him stay in the house and made him sleep in the shed. Eventually, Jerry got a job as an electrician and started working for a local radio station. It was there that he met a young woman named Darcy. She was 17 and Jerry was in his early 20s. Despite the age difference, they hit it off, and in September 1961 they got married. Darcy was pregnant with their first child at the time. They had 2 children together, a son and a daughter, and initially they lived in a nice house in Portland, Oregon. To outsiders, Jerry seemed like a regular, hard-working family man. But behind closed doors, things were different. Jerry began to show controlling behavior toward his wife, Darcy. He demanded that she do housework while either naked or in high heels. Whether she was cleaning, cooking, or doing laundry, she had to do it this way, even in front of their young children. At first, Darcy tried to keep Jerry happy, but after their second child was born in 1967, she had other priorities. With a baby to care for, she couldn't keep up with Jerry's demands. This frustrated him, and he started acting out to get her attention, like wearing women's underwear and leaving pictures around the house. But Darcy ignored him, making him even angrier. Over time, they grew apart, with Darcy staying upstairs with the kids while Jerry spent time alone in the basement with his collection of high heels and old pictures of her. As his desires grew stronger, Jerry decided to look elsewhere. One day he saw a woman walking in high heels and became fixated on her. He followed her, got on the same bus, and trailed her to her house. Once the woman went inside and the lights went off, Jerry broke in. At first, he only planned to steal some of her belongings, but when she woke up and saw him, he panicked. He jumped on her, strangled her until she was unconscious, and then assaulted her. Afterward, he stole her high heels and left. This was a turning point for Jerry. It was the first time he had committed such a horrific act. Later, he admitted that seeing her unconscious body gave him a sick sense of satisfaction. From that moment on, his desires grew darker. He wasn't satisfied with just stealing or assaulting anymore. He wanted the ultimate power. He wanted to take someone's life. On January 26, 1968, Jerry crossed an even darker line. That day, a 19-year-old girl named Linda Slauson was working as a door-to-door encyclopedia salesperson in Portland, Oregon. She knocked on Jerry's door while he was outside. He pretended to be interested in what she was selling and invited her into his house. Once inside, he led Linda to his basement. As soon as they got there, Jerry attacked her. He hit her over the head with a wooden plank, knocking her unconscious, and then strangled her. Tragically, his wife and children were upstairs in the house at the time, but Jerry didn't care. After killing Linda, he calmly gave his wife some money and asked her to take the kids out for food. With the house empty, Jerry went back to the basement. What he did next was deeply disturbing. He removed Linda's clothing, dressed her in stolen items like high heels, and took pictures of her lifeless body. Afterward, he knew he needed to come up with a plan. He couldn't keep her body forever, so he decided to dump her in Oregon's Long Tom River. However, before he did that, he did something horrifying. Jerry took a hacksaw and cut off one of Linda's feet. He kept it as a twisted trophy, storing it in his freezer. Occasionally, he would take it out, put a high heel on it, and relive what he had done in his mind. That same night, after his family went to bed, he carried Linda Slauson's body to his car. To ensure her body wouldn't surface, he tied it to a heavy piece of machinery before throwing it into the river. Her body was never found. To this day, her family hasn't been able to lay her to rest. Shortly after Linda's murder, Jerry and his family moved to a new house in Salem, Oregon. The new house had a detached garage, and Jerry decided to use it for his horrifying acts. About 10 months later, on November 26, 1968, Jerry struck again. He was driving home from work when he saw a car broken down on Interstate 5. A 23-year-old college student, Jan Whitney, was standing next to the car. She was on her way home for Thanksgiving. Jerry stopped to help and told Jan they'd need to go to his house for tools. She trusted him and agreed. Once at his house, Jerry told her to wait in the car. He came back with a leather strap and attacked her. During the struggle, he trapped her by shutting the car door on one end of the strap. Unable to escape, Jan was helpless. Jerry assaulted her and then ended her life. He took her body into the garage and did the same things he had done to Linda. He redressed her, took pictures, and committed disturbing acts. He even hung her body from a pulley for a few days. At one point, he cut off a body part to keep as a trophy. A few days later, a car crashed into Jerry's garage, leaving a hole. When police came to check, they didn't notice Jan's body, but Jerry knew it was too risky to keep her there. He tied her body to a heavy railroad iron and dumped it in the Willamette River. He also disposed of Linda's foot, which was starting to decompose. To cover his tracks, Jerry towed Jan's car away and abandoned it at a rest area. It wasn't until July 1969, about 8 months later, that Jan's body was discovered. Jerry's third victim was Karen Sprinker. a 19-year-old chemistry student at Oregon State University. On March 27, 1969, she was walking through a department store parking lot to meet her mom for lunch. Jerry, who was lurking there, saw her and immediately targeted her. He approached her with a gun and forced her into his car. Some sources say Jerry was dressed in women's clothing at the time. He drove Karen to his garage where he did horrific things. He forced her to change into different underwear and high heels while he took photos of her. Despite her attempts to stay calm, likely hoping he might let her go, Jerry had no intention of sparing her. He tied her hands behind her back, placed a rope around her neck and asked if it was too tight. When she said it was, he cruelly tightened it further, looping it over a beam and lifting her off the ground until she passed away. Jerry later admitted to authorities that he felt a disturbing sense of satisfaction from taking Karen's life. After Karen died, Jerry committed unspeakable acts with her body. Then, as he had done with previous victims, he mutilated her. He cut off both of her breasts and attempted to make a mold of them to keep as a twisted trophy. When they started to decay, he took even more pictures of Karen's lifeless body. Once he was done with these horrific acts, he tied her body to a heavy object and dumped her into the Willamette River. Jerry had become skilled at hiding evidence. By anchoring his victims' bodies before disposing of them in the water, he thought they would never be found. Meanwhile, the police were investigating the disappearances of Linda Slauson, Jan Whitney, and Karen Sprinker. Their families had reported them missing, but Jerry's meticulous efforts to cover his tracks made it difficult for the authorities to find leads. Remember, this was the late 1960s, a time without DNA testing, phone records, or CCTV. With each murder, Jerry's confidence grew. He began to act more frequently, leaving less time between his attacks. However, his next two attempts didn't go as planned, and his potential victims managed to escape. On April 21, 1969, just weeks after Karen's murder, 24-year-old Sharon Wood finished work in Portland and went to find her car in a parking garage. She couldn't remember where she had parked, so she walked around searching. That's when she noticed a man following her. Every time she looked back, he would turn away but then keep following her. This made her uneasy. Suddenly, the man tapped her on the shoulder. It was Jerry Brudos. At first, he acted confused, but then he revealed a gun and made a chilling threat, warning her that if she screamed, he would shoot. Sharon didn't stay quiet. She screamed for help, trying to make as much noise as possible. Jerry became enraged and tried to choke her, but Sharon fought back hard. She bit his thumb so hard that her jaw locked, and she couldn't let go. Jerry, in pain, pulled her hair and slammed her head onto the concrete. Eventually, Sharon's jaw loosened, and Jerry managed to escape, running to his car and speeding off. Sharon's bravery saved her life. However, Jerry didn't stop. The next day, he targeted another young girl, 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith. She was walking to school when Jerry approached her, holding a gun. He took hold of her arm and insisted she walk with him, assuring her that he wouldn't harm her or do anything wrong. As they walked, Gloria spotted a woman gardening in her front yard. She broke free and ran to the woman for help. Jerry panicked and ran off. At this point, Jerry had failed twice in a row to abduct women, showing that his carefully planned crimes were starting to fall apart. Jerry realized that his previous approach, threatening women in public places, was too risky. While it had worked on Karen Sprinker, it relied on the women being too scared to resist. If they fought back or screamed, his chances of getting caught went up. So he changed his plan. This time, Jerry decided to trick women into getting into his car by pretending to be an undercover cop. His new tactic worked, and it wouldn't be long before he would target his next victim. On April 23, 1969, Jerry spotted 22-year-old Linda Saley, a part-time student and secretary, in a parking garage. He noticed she was wearing high heels, which caught his attention. Jerry approached her, flashed a fake police badge, and accused her of shoplifting. He said he needed to take her in for questioning, and Linda, trusting him, got into his car. However, instead of driving to a police station, Jerry took her to his garage in Salem. Realizing something was wrong, Linda tried to escape but couldn't. Jerry tied her up in the garage and then went inside to have dinner with his family. During this time, Linda managed to free herself from the ropes, but Jerry returned before she could escape. He overpowered her and strangled her with a leather strap, lifting her off the ground while she struggled. Once she lost consciousness, Jerry assaulted her and ended her life. He even performed a disturbing experiment with needles and electrical wires, but it failed. The next day, Jerry tied Linda Sallee's body to a heavy piece of machinery and dumped it in the Willamette River. A couple of weeks later, 2 fishermen found her body. When police investigated, they discovered another body, Karen Sprinker, who had gone missing months earlier. Both women had been tied with the same knot and weighed down with heavy machinery, giving the investigators a crucial lead. As police interviewed students at the University of Oregon, they learned of strange phone calls from a man claiming to be a Vietnam veteran, asking women out on dates. Most of them either hung up or declined, but one student said she had agreed to meet him. During the date, she mentioned that he made an unsettling remark, asking how she could be sure he wouldn't harm her and leave her in the river. Understandably, her discomfort grew after that strange remark, and she shared her experience with the police. They advised her to let them know if he ever contacted her again, and even suggested she agree to a second date if he called. This time, the police would be there instead of her. Just a week after Linda's body was found on May 18, 1969, the man called her again, asking to meet that evening. She agreed, and when he showed up at the meeting spot, the police were waiting for him. The man turned out to be Jerry Brudos, the so-called Vietnam veteran, who had been randomly calling female students at Oregon University. The police questioned him about the murders of Linda Sallee and Karen Sprinker, whose bodies had been found in the Willamette River. Jerry denied everything, and since there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him at the time, they had to let him go. However, his suspicious behavior and disturbing comments put him on their radar, and they decided to keep a close eye on him. As investigators dug into his past, they uncovered some alarming details. Jerry was an electrician, a significant find since the victims had been tied up with electrical knots. They also discovered that, at just 18 years old, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital for attacking 2 young women. All of this made Jerry the police's top suspect. They then reached out to Sharon Wood and Gloria Jean Smith, 2 women who had survived attempted abductions in Portland just before Linda Sallee's murder. Both women were shown a photo lineup and immediately identified Jerry as their attacker. While this wasn't enough to charge him for the murders, it was enough to arrest him for the assaults. On May 29, 1969, Jerry Brudos was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. Tracking him down wasn't easy, as he was trying to avoid the police. When they finally found him, he was hiding under a blanket in the back seat of his car while his wife drove. After his arrest, the police questioned him for several days, trying to get the truth. At first, Jerry insisted he was innocent, but on June 3, 1969, he finally confessed. Jerry admitted to killing not only Linda Sallee and Karen Sprinker, but also 2 other women, Jan Whitney and an earlier victim, Linda Slauson. While Linda Slauson's body was never found, Jan Whitney's remains were recovered in July 1969, after Jerry was already behind bars. He provided horrifying details about each crime, showing no guilt or regret. He shockingly referred to his victims as objects, comparing them to candy wrappers. Once he was done with them, he'd just throw them away. Jerry's confession wasn't out of remorse. Instead, it seemed like he wanted the attention. When he realized he couldn't escape justice, he saw his confession as a way to gain notoriety. For Jerry Brudos, it was never about guilt. It was all about feeding his twisted need for attention. While the police questioned Jerry Brudos, they also got a search warrant for his property. They checked his car, which he had cleaned thoroughly to hide evidence, and searched his house and garage. The garage turned out to be a goldmine of horrifying evidence. Inside, they found a hidden stash of Polaroid pictures Jerry had taken. These photos were deeply disturbing. Some showed his victims alive, forced to pose in underwear and high heels, while others were taken after their deaths. One photo even accidentally showed Jerry himself. He had used a mirror to photograph a victim's reflection, and his face appeared in the shot. The police also found items belonging to his victims, like Jan Whitney's car keys. She was the woman whose car he had dumped at a rest stop. He had kept her keys as a trophy. They also discovered ropes with knots matching the ones used on the victims, piles of stolen underwear, and about 40 pairs of high-heeled shoes Jerry had collected. Despite Jerry's confession to 4 murders, he was charged with only 3: Jan Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sallee. They didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the first murder because Linda Slauson's body was never found. The photos he took of her mostly showed parts of her body, which wasn't enough to prove she had been killed. Without her body, the case couldn't move forward. Jerry initially pleaded not guilty because of insanity, claiming he couldn't control his actions. However, psychiatrists determined he was fully aware of what he was doing. Realizing his insanity defense wouldn't work, Jerry changed his plea to guilty. On June 27, 1969, he was sentenced to 3 life terms and sent to Oregon State Prison. Jerry's wife, Darcy, also faced charges as an accessory to murder because a neighbor claimed to have seen her helping him move a victim's body. Darcy denied knowing about Jerry's crimes, even though he committed them in their basement and garage. In court, the neighbor's testimony was discredited, and Darcy was found not guilty. After Jerry's conviction, she divorced him, changed her name, and moved away with her children. Jerry tried to appeal his sentence several times and even went before the parole board, but he was always denied. He spent 37 years in prison before dying of liver cancer on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67. Some believe Jerry may have had more victims, but it's hard to say for sure. He enjoyed the attention and took pride in his crimes, so it's possible he would have confessed if there were others. Either way, the 4 confirmed victim stories are tragic enough. That's the story of Jerry Brudos, the so-called shoe fetish slayer. What do you think? Do you believe Darcy didn't know what was happening? And do you think Jerry had more victims? Share your thoughts in the comments and let me know which case you'd like me to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. In Houston, Texas, during the 1970s, a neighborhood's sense of safety was shattered by a man whose name became synonymous with terror. He was known as the Candy Man, but behind that innocent nickname was a man named Dean Corll, a name forever tied to one of the darkest and most chilling cases in American history. Over just 3 years, he's believed to have taken the lives of at least 28 young boys. What makes this even more disturbing? He didn't act alone. 2 teenage accomplices helped him carry out these unspeakable crimes. Before we start, I need to warn you. This story is very disturbing, so the viewer's discretion is strongly advised. Let's get into it. Dean Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His childhood was tough, mainly because of his parents. His mom, Mary, and dad, Arnold, had a really unhappy marriage, and Dean often saw them fight. This made his home life tense and unstable. The couple had another son, Stanley, but when Stanley was just 4, they decided to divorce. At this point, Dean was still quite young, and the divorce, combined with his father being drafted into the Air Force, left him with a lot of confusion. After the divorce, Mary moved herself and her 2 sons to Memphis, Tennessee, to make sure they could stay in touch with their father, who was stationed far away. As a child, Dean was different from other kids. He was shy and serious, often not reacting to things the way other kids would. When he was 7, he got sick with rheumatic fever, and doctors later discovered it caused a heart murmur. Because of this, Dean was told to avoid activities like sports, which made him feel even more isolated from the other boys. When Dean was about 11, his parents tried to get back together after World War II ended. They moved to Texas, where things weren't much better. Dean understood that things were wrong in the family, especially with his father, Arnold. He wasn't kind or supportive, and often treated Dean and his younger brother as if they were a burden. His punishments for even small mistakes were harsh and aggressive. Eventually, the second marriage between Mary and Arnold fell apart, and they got divorced again. After that, Mary worked long hours to support her children, leaving Dean and Stanley with different babysitters. During this time, Mary met a man named Jake West, a salesman. They soon married, and Jake became Dean and Stanley's stepfather. In 1955, Dean, his mother, stepfather, and brother all moved into a new home. Soon after, Mary and Jake had a daughter, Joyce. To support their 3 kids, they started a candy business, and the boys, now teenagers, pitched in with various tasks. They would go to school during the day and then come home to work at the business in the evenings. Dean and Stanley were mainly in charge of making the candy, operating the machines, and making sure everything was packaged properly. Meanwhile, Jake used his salesman skills to sell the candy. Dean graduated from high school in 1958 without any major issues. His grades were average, and he didn't have many close friends, but he spent a lot of time in the school brass band, playing the trombone. After graduation, the family moved to Houston, Texas, where their candy business started to thrive. They grew so much that they were able to open their candy store. A couple of years later, in 1962, Dean's mother asked him to move to Indiana to care for his elderly grandmother, who needed full-time assistance. While there, he met a woman, and the two began dating. However, when the woman proposed to him, Dean rejected her and returned to Houston to help with the candy business again. Back at the family home, things weren't going well between Mary and Jake. They divorced in 1963, and Mary decided to branch out on her own. She used the experience she gained from the candy business to open her own company, with Dean serving as vice president. To help grow the business, they hired a few more employees, including a teenage boy. However, things took a dark turn when the boy complained to Mary about Dean making sexual advances toward him. Instead of addressing the issue, Mary fired the boy. By the mid-60s, Dean, in his mid-20s, was called to serve in the U.S. Army. He completed his training in Louisiana, despite his heart condition, and later moved to Georgia. During this time, he began to realize that he was homosexual. Although he never openly admitted it, people around him, especially those who saw him interact with teenage boys, suspected it. After a short time in the Army, Dean requested a hardship discharge, claiming he needed to return home to help his mother. His request was granted, and in 1965 he was honorably discharged after only 10 months of service. He returned to his role as vice president of the candy business, which had recently moved to a new building across from a school. Dean began spending his days handing out free candy to local kids, especially the teenage boys. The kids in the neighborhood even gave him a few nicknames, like the Candy Man and the Pied Piper. The second nickname, inspired by the famous tale, seemed to fit perfectly as Dean started luring boys in with the offer of free candy. He also set up a pool table at the back of his property, hoping to attract local boys looking for a place to hang out and have fun. In 1967, Dean became close to a 12-year-old local boy named David Owen Brooks, whom he had met when David was one of the children Dean gave free candy to. Dean started hosting parties at his apartment in Pasadena, Houston, inviting local boys. At these parties, Dean encouraged the boys to sniff glue and paint, which gave him a chance to spend more time with David and the other boys. He and David grew even closer, spending a lot of time together, playing pool, going on trips with other boys, and bonding. Dean began acting like a father figure to David, giving him money when needed, and David trusted him with personal secrets. However, over time, Dean's intentions grew less innocent. By 1969, their relationship turned sexual, with Dean bribing David into letting him do things he should never have. At the time, Dean was 30 years old, and David was only 14. Dean's candy business had failed, and his mother had to shut it down due to financial struggles. Dean found a new job as an electrician to support himself. His mother moved to Colorado with his stepsister, and they stayed in touch but never saw each other again. Over time, Dean's fantasies grew darker. What started with an obsession for younger boys quickly escalated into a dark desire for power and control, with his fantasies becoming increasingly disturbing over time. It was during this period that he committed his first murder. In 1970, Dean's first known victim was 19-year-old Jeffrey Allen Conan, a student at the University of Texas. Jeffrey disappeared on September 25, 1970, while hitchhiking to his parents' house in Houston. It's believed that Dean picked Jeffrey up, took him to his house, and there, he tied him up, tortured him, and ultimately strangled him to death. Just as Dean was about to dispose of the body, David entered Dean's apartment and was shocked by what he saw. David was terrified by what he had seen but didn't speak up. Sensing his fear, Dean promised to buy him a car if he stayed silent. To make the deal even more tempting, Dean offered him $200 for every boy he brought to him. With financial struggles of his own, David, desperate for money, agreed to Dean's deal. On December 13, 1970, David brought two boys, 14-year-old James Glass and 15-year-old Danny Yates, to Dean's apartment. David had talked to them at a religious rally and convinced them to come along. Once at Dean's apartment, Dean tied them up, assaulted them, and strangled them. He buried their bodies in a rented boat shed to make sure they wouldn't be found. Just 2 months later, Dean took the lives of two more boys. 15-year-old Donald Waldrop and his 13-year-old brother Jerry. The boys were walking home when Dean and David picked them up in Dean's van. They were taken to Dean's apartment where they were tied up, assaulted, and strangled. Just like the others, their bodies were buried in the boat shed. In 1971, Dean's killing spree continued with 3 more boys: 15-year-old Randall Harvey, 13-year-old David Hilligiest, and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle, each meeting the same tragic fate. The search for the missing boys was intense, and their parents were desperate for answers. One local boy, Elmer Wayne Henley, who was close friends with David Hilligiest, helped by posting missing posters around town. His name would soon become important in the case, so keep that in mind. On August 17, 1971, Dean and David found 17-year-old Reuben Watson walking home from a movie. They invited him to a party at Dean's apartment. Once there, Reuben was tortured and strangled, and his body was buried in Dean's boat shed. A few months later, David lured 15-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, yes, the same boy who'd been hanging up posters for the missing kids, back to Dean's apartment. At first, Elmer was just another victim, but Dean had a different plan. Instead of killing him, Dean decided he could use Elmer as an accomplice, just like David. He promised Elmer $200 for every boy he could bring to the apartment. Elmer, needing the money, agreed. Dean told him he was involved in a sex slavery ring from Dallas and that he needed help finding young boys to sell. Elmer believed Dean's story and went along with it. However, it didn't take long for Elmer to become more than just a helper. He started taking part in the murders himself. Elmer's first victim was 18-year-old Frank Anthony Aguirre, a close friend of his. After his shift at a local restaurant, Frank was walking to his car when Dean, David, and Elmer pulled up in their van. They invited him to the apartment to drink and get high. Once inside, Frank was tricked into handcuffing himself. Elmer and Dean then bound him, leaving him alone while they tortured him. Elmer later walked in and realized Dean's true intentions. There was no sex ring, only murder. Despite this, Elmer kept helping Dean and David. Then, on April 20th, 1972, Dean and Elmer kidnapped another of Elmer's friends, 17-year-old Mark Scott. This time, they didn't lure him in. They grabbed him by force. Mark fought back, but when he saw Elmer pull out a gun, he stopped resisting. Mark was tortured, assaulted, and buried on High Island Beach. David later said that Elmer had become more sadistic. He no longer helped out of fear. He seemed to be enjoying the violence. The next victims were 17-year-old Billie Jean Balch and 16-year-old Johnny Ray DeLome. The 2 boys were tied to Dean's bed. Elmer strangled Billy, then shocked everyone by calling Johnny's name before shooting him in the forehead and strangling him too. On June 26, 1972, Dean moved to an apartment at Westcott Towers. It was here that Dean, David, and Elmer abducted and killed 4 more victims. The first was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman on July 20th. Then, on October 3rd, they kidnapped 2 teenage boys, Wally J. and Richard Hembry. On November 12th, they abducted 19-year-old Richard Kepner. After that, they moved to Spring Branch in Houston. Within 2 weeks, they abducted 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, who was assaulted and killed as well. Dean quickly moved again, this time to 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena on March 7, 1973. For the first 3 months, no victims were reported, which some people believed was due to Dean's health issues. But from June to July, the killings resumed at a fast pace. Between June and July 1973, they abducted and killed 3 more victims, burying them at Lake Sam Rayburn. The first was 15-year-old Billy Ray Lawrence, a friend of Elmer's, who was lured under the pretense of going fishing. Next, on June 15th, 20-year-old Ray Blackburn, who was hitchhiking to visit his wife and newborn child, was murdered. Then, Elmer met 15-year-old Homer Garcia at driving school. He lured Homer to Dean's apartment, where he was assaulted, shot, and killed. On July 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers was kidnapped and later buried at High Island Beach. Around this time, David Brooks, who had recently gotten married and was about to become a father, started depending more on Elmer Henley to help with the kidnappings. Between July 19th and 25th, Elmer and Dean abducted and killed 3 more boys: 15-year-old Michael Balch, the younger brother of a previous victim, 18-year-old Marty Jones, and 17-year-old Charles Cobble. One of the victims was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn, while the other two were buried in the boat shed. The final victim of Dean and his accomplices was 13-year-old James Dremala. James had been out riding his bike when Dean and Elmer lured him back to the apartment. He was tortured, assaulted, and strangled before being buried in the boat shed. James Dremala's death was the last one before everything unraveled. On August 7, 1973, Elmer Henley invited 19-year-old Timothy Corll Curley to a party they were having at Dean's house. Timothy agreed, and when he arrived, he and Elmer sniffed paint fumes and got drunk before leaving to buy some sandwiches. On the way back, they stopped near Houston Heights, where they met 15-year-old Rhonda Williams. She had just left her home after being abused by her drunk father, and Elmer invited her to stay at Dean's place. At 3 a.m. on August 8th, when they arrived at the house, Dean was furious that Rhonda had been brought along. Elmer explained what happened with her father, and Dean eventually calmed down. He offered them beer and marijuana, and the three of them passed out. A few hours later, Elmer woke up to find himself handcuffed, with Timothy and Rhonda also bound and gagged. Dean was angry about Rhonda's presence and told Elmer he was going to continue torturing and assaulting Timothy and Rhonda before killing them. This was the beginning of the end for the group, and it marked the last known victims in this horrific chain of events. After Dean had brutally assaulted Timothy and Rhonda, he kicked Rhonda hard in the chest multiple times. Then he dragged Elmer into the kitchen and threatened to shoot him. Trying to stay calm, Elmer spoke to Dean and assured him that he would help with the murders if Dean let him go. Dean agreed, untied Elmer and handed him a knife, ordering him to kill Rhonda. In that moment, Elmer realized the weight of his actions over the past 3 years. He had been part of so many terrible crimes, and he knew he couldn't take another innocent life. Determined to stop the horror, Elmer grabbed Dean's pistol, aimed it at him, and fired a shot into his forehead. Dean stumbled but didn't fall immediately, so Elmer fired again, hitting him multiple times. Finally, Dean collapsed to the floor, dead. His reign of terror had come to an end and the nightmare was over. Elmer quickly untied the other victims, helped them get dressed, and they all nervously discussed what to do next. Elmer suggested they leave quietly without telling anyone, but Timothy insisted they call the police. At 8:24 a.m. on August 8, 1973, Elmer picked up the phone and told the police he had killed someone, giving them the address before hanging up. The 3 teenagers waited outside for the police to arrive. When the officers got there, they put the group into a patrol car and went inside to investigate. They found Dean's body lying in the hallway and immediately arrested Elmer. At the police station, as the officers read Elmer his rights, he didn't hold back. He openly admitted to all the terrible acts he had committed with Dean, confessing to helping abduct and murder young boys over the past 3 years. He also shared specific details about where the victims were buried. At first, the police were unsure if they could believe him, but as Elmer provided the victims' names, they realized he was telling the truth. The investigation uncovered disturbing evidence at Dean's home, including a torture rack and weapons used in the crimes. In Dean's van, police found curtains covering the windows, a large rope, a mud-stained rug, and a crate with holes drilled in it, likely to allow air. When they searched a boat shed Dean had rented, they discovered even more horrifying items: a stripped car, a child's bike, and a box of boys' clothing. As they dug in the shed, they found the body of a boy wrapped in plastic. More digging revealed several other bodies, all showing signs of abuse and torture. By the end of August 8, 1973, police had uncovered 8 bodies in the shed. That same day, David Brooks came forward. Although he initially denied being involved, he admitted he knew about the murders. He later helped police find more victims. David led them to Lake Sam Rayburn, where they recovered 2 more bodies. Returning to the boat shed, investigators dug up 9 additional sets of remains. In the days that followed, the total number of victims grew to 27. Elmer and David helped authorities locate the burial sites, and by April 1974, 21 of the victims were identified. Investigators later confirmed that Dean had killed at least 28 boys between 1970 and 1973, making it one of the most horrifying killing sprees in U.S. history. Over the years, there have been several possible identifications of remains that are believed to be more victims of Dean Corll. However, as of now, these are the only confirmed victims. Elmer Wayne and David Brooks faced separate trials for their involvement in the attacks. On July 1, 1974, Elmer was charged with 6 murders that took place between March 1972 and July 1973. There was a lot of evidence against him, including Billy Balch, who had been tortured by Dean but was later freed by David Brooks. Elmer was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year prison terms, 1 for each murder. He appealed his sentence and was given a retrial in December 1978, but the court upheld the same sentence. David Brooks' trial began on February 27, 1975. He was initially indicted for murders between December 1970 and June 1973. However, when he went to trial, he was only charged with 1 murder, Billy Ray Lawrence's death in 1973. The argument in his defense was that David didn't actually kill the victims, but instead, he brought them to Dean and Elmer. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes before finding David guilty of Billy Ray Lawrence's murder. On March 4, 1975, he was sentenced to life in prison. He appealed, claiming his confessions were made without legal rights being read to him, but the appeal was denied. As of January 2025, Elmer Wayne Henley remains incarcerated at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Mark W. Michael Unit. David Owen Brooks, however, passed away on May 28, 2020, at the age of 65, due to complications related to COVID-19 while serving his life sentence. Brooks's death closed a chapter in one of the most disturbing cases in U.S. criminal history. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe justice was served with the sentences handed down? How do cases like this help us understand criminal behavior and the importance of staying alert in our communities? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story insightful, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with friends who follow true crime stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.